this video, we are going to be going over part 2 of our settings, starting with used options. If you missed the first part and you want to see the settings earlier in the screen, you're going to need to look to that video. Should be before this one in the playlist. So we're going to flip here to our VM and just go down to used options. For use/trade-in pricing style, you have the choice of either extended pricing or condition discounts. The default is extended pricing. With extended pricing, you'll utilize the used price 1, used price 2 fields, as well as for trade-ins, trade-in price 1 and 2, and then trade-in price cash 1 and 2. If you're not using extended pricing, if you're using the condition discounts, then the only ones of those that are used price 1 and trade-in price 1. By default, condition 1 is complete, condition 2 is incomplete, but you can really call those whatever you'd like. If we go to condition discounts, on the other hand, so as I mentioned, then the inventory fields for prices 2 and for cash are not used. Instead, your trade-in value is going to be set to either credit or cash, and then you'll either give a percentage bonus for store credit or a percentage less for cash, which can be 0 depending on your store. For condition codes, you can then use A, B, C, D, E grading. You can name those just whatever you want. You can give whatever percent off the used price and the trade-in price that you want for those, but it does mean that you're going to be using those same percentages across the board for all items. It's not going to be different items have different grading scales. For do not accept trade-ins for walk-in customers, that's fairly self-explanatory. It means that you actually have to select and set up a customer other than the default in order to take a trade. Many of our customers are required to report the trade-ins and who's trading things in locally, or at least keep records of it, like with a driver's license and everything. So that is what that is for. Suggest used when available. If new copy sold, we'll simply provide a pop-up when you scan an item for sale new, saying you have an in-stock used. Does the customer want it used? That can be used both to prevent mistakes from a cashier, accidentally selling something as new if it's used only, or it can also be used to upsell to the customer, because generally speaking the margins on used product is better, so you want to move that. Under security, we have a few settings here related to the security of the software. Audit quantity changes will make it so that when you change a quantity directly in inventory, you have to put in a reason, and it will be recorded and logged as who changed it, when, and why. And you can view that on the reports menu, and that can be used to obviously prevent loss. Prompt cashier ID will require at the end of a transaction that you put in the cashier ID and the password to complete the transaction. Require password for clock in/clock out. Will make it so if you're using the time clock, then employees who are clocking in and out have to put in their password. Otherwise, they can simply be clocked in and clocked out by going into the screen and hitting a button. Allow only the current date for reports for non-administrators. For all of the reports that have a time component, primarily the sales reports, that will make it so that they cannot run it for anything other than midnight to midnight today. You can run it for a subsection of that, so you can run it for your shift or whatever, but you can't run it for anything outside of the current day if you're not an administrator. Allow dry run physical inventory. That basically makes it so that if anybody who does not have the physical inventory permission, which is a bit of a dangerous permission where if you mess it up, then you can accidentally wipe all of your inventory quantities and you have to go to a backup. That will make it so anybody can go into physical inventory, but you have to have the permission to complete it. By default, you can't even get into physical inventory unless you are an administrator or have the physical inventory permission. Allow negative price changes allows you to change the price of an item to be negative. Um, Typically, we don't recommend this, but it is something you can do if you're wanting to make things a coupon or that kind of thing. We strongly recommend against doing it because it's very easy to make a mistake and actually end up like charging somebody for a trade-in or that kind of thing if you've got that on. Under register options, this is related settings related to the register, what you're doing when checking people out that don't fit under the other sections. Prompt when selling out of stock item. That will allow it when you sell an item and you're out of stock of it. It will allow you to place an order. It will allow you to, if you're an enterprise user, stock check it. Depending on your other options, you may be able to just sell it anyways as an option as well. And of course, you can cancel. If you have do not sell out of stock items on, then you won't be able to sell anyway when you're out of stock. And depending on if you have prompt on or not, you'll either just be rejected if you try to sell something that's out of stock, or it'll force you to either place a special order or cancel. Promotion combined lines actually is the feature that if you have an item on the invoice already and you scan another copy of it, it will simply add it to the quantity of the copy already on the invoice rather than creating a different line. If that is off, then it will create separate lines. It's very important to leave that off if you might need to change that price to be different for those two items. So if you're using like generic items other than the miscellaneous item in the system, and you just change prices based on the circumstances, you probably want that off. Promotion prices determines whether the promotions feature is turned on for the software. Even if you have this turned on, unless you've gone and set up promotions, that won't do anything. So there are actually 4 settings for this. There's off, there's automatic, which is effectively always on, and then manual default on will have promotions on, but will allow the cashier to turn them off for a specific invoice if they want to. And manual is the other way around. It defaults off, but the cashier can actually turn them on for a specific invoice if they want to. Do not sell inactive items prevents you from putting an inactive item on the invoice. It will actually just error out if you try to not just sell, but also trade or return. It will actually block that. Last price automatic override. This one's a little complicated. Unless you know you want it, you probably don't. But basically, if you have a customer who gets an item and they get it for something other than the price you have listed in inventory, when they come back in and they buy that same item under the same customer ID, it will ask if you want to give them the price they paid the last time rather than the current listed price. So if you're giving like a manual discount to a customer every time, that can be used for that kind of thing. But very few customers actually do use that. We do have customers who use it, but unless you know that's something you want, you probably don't want it. Default invoice items to new or used simply determines when you go into the register or when a new invoice is started, whether the used checkbox is checked. You should probably set that based on the majority of your product in your store. If you do almost all used, you almost certainly want that to be used. If you do almost all new, then you probably want it to be new. Search item ID 2 and 3 when scanning. These two settings are very similar, so we're just going to go over them together. They make it so when you scan an item, it will actually look not just in the primary item ID field, but it'll also check the other 2 ID fields. So if an item has multiple barcodes, then you can find it under those different barcodes. Percent added to max deposit for pre-orders and special orders. What we're effectively allowing you to do here is when you are getting a order that's going to be paid for in advance in full, you can collect a percent above the price to cover the sales tax, is how this is typically used. Until they actually pick up the item, it is not sales tax because they have not bought anything until that point. But that's what you're going to use it for, to allow it so they can come back in and not have to pay the tax when they actually pick it up. Rewards points accumulated by, you can either give them a point per dollar spent or 1 point for each item that they purchase. If you want to exclude some items, and very commonly you will want to exclude like the miscellaneous item or the gift card item or the special order deposit item, then you would do that under the exclusions list. We'll get to that in a minute, probably in the next video. Do not sell items before the street date. Very simply will not allow an item to be sold until it reaches its street date. Once street date reached, continue to create pre-orders for items. If this is not checked, then the item will simply be sold normally, even if it's marked as a pre-order item once it hits its street date. Otherwise, it ignores the street date and just lets you keep creating pre-orders. Print label for trade-ins, that will happen automatically if that's checked. It will print whatever your default design is for that item to your label printer when the invoice is completed. It is worth mentioning you don't need to do that necessarily, because there is a function in the software on the transaction screen to print all of the labels that were traded in on an invoice. So if you turn that off because you don't always keep the right, color label in your printer or anything like that, then you should be okay. You're not like locking yourself out of being able to print all the items on an invoice without having to track them down one by one. Print price 1/A for trade-ins of any condition. That simply means that it will print the complete price for anything that gets traded, whether or not you took it in trade as complete. If you're going to replace the manual inbox, that can sometimes be something you'll want to turn on. Show used add-on items. This is a fairly obscure feature if you're using what are called add-on items, where when you sell an item, it asks if you want to sell additional items such as warranties, or it can be used for things like toppings on food. Then if you check this, you can sell those add-on items used. Otherwise, they are new only. The new only screen is maybe a little cleaner to look at, and so if you don't do used, or if your add-on products would not make sense used, for example, if you're like selling pizza through the system or something, you hopefully are not selling a used pepperoni, then that checkbox may make more sense to be off. Require reason for returns makes it so the cashier has to enter the reason that the customer gives for returning an item, and it records that for later viewing to make sure people are giving at least legitimate sounding reasons for returning items. Do not allow override for used max. The used max feature normally just says, you have 3 in stock, your used max is 3, do you still want to take this trade, and warns you that you're at the used max and allows you to say, yes, I want to take it anyway. If you check that box, then you cannot override that, and you must decline the trade if you've hit your used max. Record tips will allow you to actually record cash tips at the complete transaction screen for the purpose of reporting them to the government. We're going to end part 2 of this video here. This is like the largest stretch of settings. We will pick up with the customer settings and item maintenance settings in part 3.